everyone. Well done for coming to the first session of the day. And looking forward to another great day at the conference. I'm just going to introduce Jack, who is giving our talk on consciousness, philosophy and animal welfare. Jack Hawke is currently undertaking a research master's in philosophy at ANU. Earlier, he completed a graduate program at the Australian Department of Health and Aged Care, and before that, he completed a Bachelor of Politics, Philosophy and Economics with honours at ANU as well. If we have time, we'll do a little Q&A at the end. So if you are on the internet, you can use Hawke to submit your questions, but if we are having difficulty with that, we can just go old school and do hands up. So we'll see how we go. All right.
Thank you very much. Yes, so welcome. So I'll do three things in this talk. First, I'll introduce you to a framework to understand research in animal welfare. Secondly, I'll explain why animal consciousness is very important to understanding animal welfare. And lastly, I'll explain what a scientifically tractable and potentially fruitful study of consciousness looks like. Okay? So, by implication, anyone who cares about animal welfare should care about animal consciousness. So, I'm just going to go quite roughly what is welfare. So, I take these claims to be not controversial, and so I won't really explain them. I won't really go into depth with them. So a being with welfare is a being that has some intrinsic moral worth on its own right, so by virtue of its existence. So by that I mean, you might think of some things as being instrumentally valuable, so, the value of rocks, the value of a river. That could be because of its role in the ecosystem, because of its beauty, but it's not to do with its own existence, right? But I take it that by welfare we mean something more substantive than that. And a being with welfare is capable of flourishing and suffering. And a being with welfare deserves some kind of just treatment in virtue of its capability for flourishing and suffering. So the study of animal welfare then is the study of what animals have welfare, to what extent they have welfare, and what factors are related to their welfare, and so on. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to introduce you to three approaches to understanding animal welfare, and this is coming from a framework introduced by Henry Shefflin from Cambridge. So according to him, the first approach says having welfare is just a matter of having the relevant affective states. Okay, well, what are affective states? So they're also called valence states. So they basically involve this capacity for evaluating a state of affairs, whether or not it's positive or negative, right? So there could be more advanced ways of affective states. So for example, in humans, we're able to have emotions, mood, temperament, and so on. But I'm just more concerned about the basic capacity, so sensations like pain or pleasure. Okay? The second approach says that welfare is a matter of showing the right kind of behaviors, right? So what are these behaviors? These are behaviors that show that the animals in question have wants and needs, they have certain preferences, and they have certain desires, okay? And the third approach, the one that I'm going to argue for, is that welfare, animals that have welfare are animals that are conscious. And the extent to which they have welfare depends on the extent to which they have conscious experiences, okay? So what do I mean by consciousness? Well, this is a really vexed issue. And I'm not really going to go into the philosophical weeds of it, but I'm just going to assume, and I believe that you would assume with me, that consciousness involves a kind of subjective point of view, a kind of subjective experience of the world. So we can define it by examples, right? So consciousness involves things that we experience when we're awake, when we're not in a coma, when we're not in a dreamless sleep, right? So these are kind of things that We know we're in it when we feel pain, or when we perceive things, or when we have a mental imagery of something. So I'm just going to take those things as kind of giving a working definition of consciousness, and you might think that those things turn out not to be conscious, or you need an extra element in order for those experiences to be conscious. But that's controversial in the literature. So I'm not going to assume that from the start. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a bit about each approach, but I'm going to eventually deny the first two approaches and say that the third approach is the most viable one. So what is the affective state approach? Well, it says, this is one example, one influential example in the animal pain literature. So it says, to understand whether an animal is capable of experiencing pain, we just need to know two things, two main things. One, pain should give this animal a range of responses to it, right? So a painful experience should involve a whole body changes in terms of its neurological changes, so nociception, physiological changes like respiration, heart rate, and behavioral changes like wound guarding, limping, and so on. Okay? And the second thing is that painful experience should result in the animal changing its attitude towards the environment, the way in which it interacts with it. So it should display conditioned place avoidance, right, where it's been hurt. It should prefer to receive analgesics, right? So these seem very kind of uncontroversial, right? I mean, it's just intuitive that, you know, analgesics relieve pain in us, so we should also expect animals who can feel pain to experience the same thing. So, but what I'm arguing is that this approach, while it looks nice and it gives us some evidence, there's a reason that it doesn't tell us everything, and I'll get to that in a bit. Right, so I've kind of gone through these. So yeah, but before then, I'll talk about the results, right? So according to this review, which is already a bit outdated, many of these indicators are met by mammals, birds, and fish. So we're kind of highly confident that they are able to feel pain. In terms of cephalopods, so these are octopuses and squids and so on, and also decapods, so these are crabs, lobsters, and prawns, and so on. They have mixed results, so we're not quite sure. And what we're in doubt are amphibians, so these are frogs, and reptiles and insects. So there's not a lot of evidence that they're able to feel pain. So this seems like a fruitful way to study animal pain, right? But I'm going to argue that there are problems with it, right? So the first problem is that, well, it's not really saying whether these states are consciously experienced or not, right? So valence is a kind of scientifically operationalized concept that assigns a positive or a negative to the animal's behavior. So it's not really telling us that there is pain or pleasure. It's trying to avoid that question, right? There's a reason why people in the literature use phrases like pain-like behavior rather than painful behavior, right? So if it's not talking about consciousness, then it's just talking about something else, something that we don't care about, right? If we care about suffering, then we have to talk about consciousness. The second reply, which comes from Elizabeth Irvine, is that, who gives a counterexample. So the C. elegans roundworm, which famously has 302 neurons, so a very simple nervous system, is nonetheless able to show lots of complexity in its behavior, and it's able to meet many of these indicators. But it seems like we're a bit hesitant to say that because of that, these animals are conscious. At least we need some account that tells us why this is so. Okay? So we have to take a stance on consciousness. We can't just pretend that it's not a question. Okay, so if we can't ignore consciousness, what can we do? Well, The other approach says, well, let's just say, actively argue that consciousness is not important, right? So this is the route taken by, famously by Marion Dawkins from Oxford. And she says, what matters is whether animals are healthy and whether what animals prefer or want. Okay? So part of the motivation for this argument is, well, consciousness is just not scientifically tractable. How are we going to study it, right? And especially because philosophers haven't really figured out what it is. Therefore, we can't study it in science. And secondly, well, there's also this approach from welfare economists that kind of look at people's preferences as reflected by their consumption behavior as constituting what's good for them. So the idea is that we don't have to impose, or we don't have to take some assumptions about happiness or so on. We can just kind of look at their preferences. And so an example of this approach as given by Dawkins is by observing that dolphins typically leave the feeding ground when boats with tourists are around. We know that they prefer to be left alone, right? Plain and simple. But I'm going to raise some problems with that approach as well. So the first approach is that, well, the first problem is that by the same light, a lot of other psychological categories are also not scientifically tractable, right? So emotions, for example, right? We think of emotions as these distinct categories like anger and disgust and so on, and they're related to a distinct set of physiological and behavioral, face expression and that kind of thing, responses. That's not true. That's simply not, there's a lot of debate in science that says that that's not true. Another example, intelligence, right? We think of intelligence, at least in the human context, as something to do with problem solving, about cognitive processing, and abstract thinking and so on. Well, in the animal kingdom, intelligence is actually much more controversial than it seems, right? Are bees intelligent when they dance in a certain way that tells other bees where the hives are, right? So these are questions that are far from settled in either the philosophical or scientific literature, but people feel free to use these concepts. And so the second problem is that claims about what animals prefer or want seem to have assumptions about consciousness built into them, right? So when we say that the dolphins would rather be left alone, we often mean, well, the dolphins feel distressed when tourists are around, right? How else are we going to understand that? And the final objection is animals, what they prefer and what they want are up for interpretation, right? So, a paramecium, a single-celled paramecium, reaches towards the light source. Does that mean it wants to be near that light source? Well, it's really difficult for us to say one way or another, right? Okay. So what I've done so far is I've kind of explained to you a framework, and I've argued that consciousness is very important. We can't bypass it. We can't say it doesn't matter. Okay. So now I'm going to explain to you what a scientifically tractable and potentially fruitful study of consciousness looks like. Okay, so this is what's called the consciousness-based approach by Shefflin. So there's been an explosion of work in the past few years on this subject. So all these books here are published after 2016, and the Animal Sentience Journal is also founded in 2016, so they're all quite recent. So I'll just tell you a little bit more about consciousness. So you might have heard of these phrases. So all they're doing is they're pointing to one thing, which is that consciousness is mysterious. There seems to be a bit of epistemic difficulty surrounding consciousness, right? The idea is that once we've explained everything there is to know about consciousness empirically, there is still something left out, right? So that's the idea. And David Chalmers, who wrote a book on consciousness, this might be amusing to you. So he trained as a mathematician before becoming a philosopher. So he likes to say, can we explain consciousness empirically? Can we explain consciousness exhaustively without remainder by the natural sciences, right? So he's kind of treating consciousness as a long division kind of exercise without remainder. Okay, so the first solution to this problem is to say, well, there is no such thing as a heart problem or a gap, right? It's just a product of our culture or our language, right? But that's controversial and too quick. So I'm going to appeal to the second solution, which is to say, let's just kind of do a bunch of science, do a bunch of empirical work, and then over time, hopefully we'll achieve some kind of conceptual change, and so we can actually close the gap, so to speak. So one example comes from the topic of life. So people used to wonder, why is it that organisms that are alive seem to just act on their own volition? They can just move, right? It seems like no amount of explanation of the kind of inner workings of an organism will explain why it kind of moves this way rather than that way. But actually, we now have a very good understanding empirically about life, right? So we know that it consists of elements like metabolism, right? The need to maintain a boundary between you and the world, and the need for a certain level of stability and so on. So there is no mystery, right? People used to think, well, we need to posit some further things, some kind of vital spirits about life to explain that. Well, we no longer see the need to do that. And I think the same thing can be said for consciousness. All right, so now I'm going to talk about how do we actually study animal consciousness, right? So the first way is to just kind of say, let's just grab theories from human consciousness science and apply that to animals. And some people do that. But I'm going to argue against that because, well, firstly, it assumes that we're talking about the same thing when we're talking about human consciousness and animal consciousness, right? So it seems like it's a bit anthropocentric, and also it rejects the possibility of consciousness in many animals. And I can explain that a bit further if you want in Q&A. And the second approach is to just kind of see what biology or evolution tells us about the role of consciousness. And lastly, this is the approach that I favor, that I'll endorse. We can find a cluster of indicators that tell us about the existence of consciousness. So the biological approach, so Colin Klein from my institution, ANU, and Peter Godfrey-Smith are two advocates of this approach. So Peter Godfrey-Smith, he gives an account that says consciousness evolved out of the need for animals to coordinate their activities in order to stay alive. So these include being able to monitor the environment for any prey or predators, and detect internal changes like tissue damage and hunger, and guiding their actions based on these kinds of internal and external changes. Right. So this is kind of the gist of it. And it's very plausible, and it's supported by a lot of evolutionary evidence, right? So Peter Godfrey-Smith draws on a lot of the evidence from the Cambrian explosion, even before the Cambrian explosion, to kind of suggest that there were these environmental changes that selected for the need for organisms to compete against each other. And so you get this kind of story for how this kind of subjectivity evolved. But I think there are some concerns with it. I think it's too quick, right? So firstly, it's not very useful to study consciousness in contemporary animals, right? So it kind of talks about the origins of consciousness. That's good. But we want to know things like insects today, which insects today might be conscious. Well, it doesn't really tell us much. It just tells us that consciousness likely evolved before the arrival of insects. Okay? So, and so as a result, some will say that this is too permissive, and some will say that this is too strict, right? The capacity that Peter Godfrey-Smith takes to be associated with consciousness. So in general, the idea is that we don't yet have enough evidence in order to theorize. So what do we do when we're in this kind of nascent stage of scientific inquiry? Well, here comes the cluster approach, which is the approach that I'll endorse. And so Jonathan Birch from LSE and Tim Bain from Monash are the two major advocates of this approach. And so according to them, let's look at how we study diseases, right? So diseases, well, first we just notice some symptoms. So you might have a cold, you might have some fever symptoms, but you don't really know why or how, but you just kind of study them, like in patients. And then you just kind of get this cluster of indicators that seem to co-occur together, right, in patients that have a particular disease. And then you can hopefully come to providing some kind of underlying causal mechanism. So what kind of viruses cause the disease, how these viruses transmit between people, how they grow inside the body, and so on, right? But first, all you have are just the indicators, right? So the hypothesis then, as provided by Birch, is that consciousness also facilitates a range of cognitive abilities, right? So the idea is that there should be a cluster of markers that co-occur in conscious individuals, and they don't occur in unconscious individuals. And then once we have evidence of that in humans, then we can apply that across species to see if there's also a cluster of markers that exist in certain species and they don't exist in other species. And then finally, we can see if they appear together in evolutionary time by looking at evidence from archaeological records and so on. And so the hope is that if we find this cluster, it tells us something about the existence of consciousness. It may not tell us the cluster about the existence of consciousness. There may be no cluster, but that's, at this moment, we're not quite clear, right? And so we want to just look for evidence. So we need some kind of account that guides that kind of investigation, and theory should come later. Okay, so quickly, so the advantages of the cluster approach. First, it avoids the problem of committing to a theory too impatiently, right? So what we're seeing time and time again in my research is that someone takes a theory or comes up with a theory, applies it to animals, and then there's a whole bunch of replies that say, well, you know, have you considered this? Have you considered that? Here's a counterexample, and so on. So it just seems like we're not at that stage yet to be ready to theorize. And secondly, it's supposed to guide science, right? Providing a tractable way and potentially fruitful way to study consciousness scientifically. And also, it has the added advantage of being consistent with currently popular theories of consciousness. So whatever theories you might have heard of, global workspace, information integration, these kind of theories that we have in the human case, they're all consistent with the facilitation hypothesis, right? So it doesn't rule out any theory from the get-go. Okay, main takeaway. So first, we can't understand animal welfare by only looking at affective states or preferences. Consciousness is crucial. And secondly, animal consciousness is scientifically tractable, and we can best study it using the cluster approach. And by implication, anyone who cares about animal welfare should care about animal consciousness. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jack. We've got 1 minute if anyone has a burning question. I'll just open it up for a second. No? Oh, okay, right, yes.
Would you think of consciousness then as something that could be a spectrum, or is it binary?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So there's been some discussion about consciousness being multidimensional. So there could be different manifestations of consciousness. So the famous example that Peter Godfrey-Smith uses is like a snail has affective, so they can feel things, but they can't really perceive much, so they're lacking in sensory. And then a spider can sense things, but then they're lacking in affective. So there could be different modes of being. I think that's the phrase that Peter Godfrey-Smith uses, or something like experience profile or something. So it could be not a binary thing. Yeah.
Just quickly, did you have a question on the back as well? All right, well, we might wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Jack. And I guess if anyone has any questions. Yeah.
I'll stick around.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Jack.
Right. Thanks.